So anger is a problem that many of us struggle with, particularly within practice, and I'll discuss one syndrome of that I've seen coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing to the channel. So over the years, I've heard of several major, very prominent teachers who have dealt with anger management issues during their lives. Some of them during their teaching career, others at the beginning, and they felt that they had to go through, over a year sometimes of anger management training, which metta training, we call metta meditation, in order to overcome that. Now, metta is the Pali word for, it's translated usually as loving kindness. Another very good translation is boundless friendliness. It's a kind of training which I've discussed in the past. I have an earlier video on it, much earlier, so it's not quite the same video quality as this one, but I'll put it up on the screen nevertheless. I'll link to it if you're interested. But basically, it's a training where we try to spend time envisioning kind thoughts towards other people. And this is not meant to be not meant to be like prayer. It's not meant to change things in the outer world. It's meant to be a kind of psychological training where we're trying to change things inwardly, trying to change the way we think about people, the way that we approach the world, so that we try to replace thoughts of anger, we try to replace feelings of anger with thoughts of friendliness and feelings of friendliness. And this can be, over long periods of time, a very effective kind of meditative practice. And so, as I say, several prominent teachers that I've heard of have done this for long periods of time in order to overcome their own anger issues. And I won't go into the names because, I don't want to gossip about people, and some of this I've heard indirectly through other people, so maybe I'm not correct, but nevertheless, I've certainly heard of it in several occasions. But having said this, I want to get to the meat of the discussion, which is that oftentimes this kind of training, particularly over short periods of time, can have its pitfalls. And I think we should be aware of that, both in ourselves and in others. And I think if any of us have really been in Buddhist meditation or practice circles for any period of time, we'll be aware of certain people within that context who are at times, let's say, overly loving, overly kind, expressly kind towards people in a way that seems very nice, seems very pleasant, but at the same time feels a little bit forced. And oftentimes these same people will tend to also have a kind of strange multiple personality kind of thing, where in one moment they are overtly kind and sweet and generous, and then some small thing will happen, and all of a sudden they'll lash out. And I don't know that there's a term for this, but I'll coin one here just for the sake of argument. I call it brittle metta. It's brittle metta. It's a kind of metta, or a loving kindness, that is brittle, that tends to break very quickly, that tends to break with the slightest tinge of a problem. And one thing about brittle metta is that I find it to be a prominent and prevalent example of spiritual bypassing. And spiritual bypassing is something I discussed in a prior video, which I'll put up here on the screen in case you're interested in hearing more about it. Basically, spiritual bypassing is when we delude ourselves into believing that we're farther along the path than we really are. That is, that instead of dealing with negative emotions, such as anger, such as greed, such as forms of ignorance, instead of dealing with them, instead of recognizing them as such and recognizing our imperfect natures, instead we pretend that those things don't exist. We push them off to the side. As a result, we bypass them. Instead of dealing with them, we bypass them. This is a recipe for disaster, or not disaster, but it's a recipe for difficulty down the road. Because insofar as these kinds of emotions have only been bypassed and not dealt with, they tend to re-arise. And metta practice, traditionally, is a practice of substituting thoughts of kindness and love for anger. And as such, it can become a form of spiritual bypassing. Now, to emphasize here, I don't mean it always is, but it can become, particularly if the anger is very strong. If we're dealing with something very strong and very persistent, then working with metta, which is just sort of pushing it off to the side, can result in bypassing it, in not dealing with it, in not coming to terms with it. And of course, in doing that, we set ourselves up for brittle metta. We set ourselves up for being in a position where the metta that we, or the kindness that we display is a little bit over the top, because we're dealing with anger that is pressing up from below, and we're dealing with a kind of metta that tends to be brittle, that tends to break under small pushes. So then what do we do instead? What's the correct practice? And as I say, the correct practice is to deal with the anger. Is to accept the anger for what it is to, I think it's even Thich Nhat Hanh's words, to embrace the anger. But this is a difficult thing to do, because there's a very fine line between embracing anger in the way that Thich Nhat Hanh means and indulging the anger. Or whatever other case we're talking about. It doesn't have to be anger, it could be jealousy, it could be greed. It could be any one of many, many unskillful kinds of emotional states. What we want to do is to embrace it in the sense of welcoming it in, but not putting it down, not putting a seat down for it at the table. That's, I think, the way Andy Alensky described it. We have to be able to welcome it in, because if we don't welcome it in, if we don't become mindful of it when it occurs, then we're basically spiritually bypassing it. We're pushing it off to the side. We're not being willing to look at it. And if that happens, it tends to re-arise. But if we can welcome it in, if we can look at it for what it is, if we can get to know it, and get to know it both as it is, and get to know the aspects of it that are problematic, in other words, become aware of the reasons why, let's say, anger or jealousy are problems, are difficulty, the reason why they're painful, to feel the pain in them, really is a great meditative practice, is to feel the pain in the anger. Because if we feel the pain in the anger, we're becoming aware viscerally, on a kind of immediate, right now sense of the problems with it. And if we can do that, then we'll be embracing the anger without indulging the anger. On the other hand, one of the problems with this kind of practice is that anger provides a rush of energy. Let's be clear here that anger can be like a drug. It can be pleasant in certain respects. It gives you a rush of energy. It gives you a rush of feeling. It gives you a rush of feeling like you can do something. It gives you a kind of a sense of self. It gives you a sense of justification, a sense of being in the right. And this is one of the reasons why I say it can be difficult to embrace anger without indulging it. Because if we embrace anger, one of the pitfalls, another pitfall on the other side, which certainly the Buddha was very aware of, is that you become too enamored of the energy that it provides, and then basically fall into its grasp. And so what we have to do is to sort of find our way through being aware of the pitfalls, being aware of the good aspects of it, but trying to, get ourselves out of the clutches of the good aspects, of the good feeling involved with it, and be aware in a wiser sense of the way that it can be a problem. Another pitfall here, I think, as outsiders, is to become cynical of the efforts of genuine practitioners when they fall afoul of this kind of brittle metta, or these kinds of examples of spiritual bypassing. And I think that there are many, many legitimate practitioners, good people, who do this, who fall into this. In fact, I think we all do from time to time. We all fall into a kind of an illusion of ourselves as being farther along the path than we really are. We all fall into the illusion of ourselves as being kinder than maybe we are in every circumstance. And so we can find ourselves falling into this from time to time where, just the other day, in a very, very kind and friendly frame of mind, something my wife said set me off, got angry, felt very remorseful about it afterwards. Even while feeling I was in the right, these kinds of silly mental operations go on all the time. So, and so brittle metta, I think, happens to an extent with all of us. Some of us may display it more than others, But the point is not to be cynical. I think we shouldn't be cynical of our own motivations. I don't think we should become cynical of the motivations of others. We should be aware that we are all imperfect, that we're all on this path, and so this will happen from time to time. So again, not to be cynical, but simply to say what to do. What is it that we should do? And what we should do is to be aware of the pitfall, to be aware of the practice of inviting the anger in, being aware of it, embracing it in the sense of becoming curious about it, become curious of its nature without indulging it. So I'd be interested if you have any comments or questions about this, if you've seen it in yourself, or if you've seen it with other people in your community, in your Sangha, if you have a local group that meets, or if you've seen it in other people who are outside of your local group. I'd be interested in having a discussion about this. Thanks so much for being here. If you're interested in more detailed issues along these lines, check out my Patreon page. I've got a link to it down below. And we will certainly catch you on the next one of these videos. So thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for your comments, and be well.